Hello and welcome to this video on conflict resolution. A conflict situation is like an iceberg. There are visible behaviours that you can see while you're having the conflict, but there are all these underlying causes that we need to address in order to be able to successfully resolve the conflict. So right now, have a little reflect and think about a difficult interaction you've had with a parent. You can pause the video now to give yourself a little more time to think about this. Consider the interaction in superficial terms, so you're just looking at specific observable behaviour. Now, I want you to go back and think about the underlying causes of these behaviours, the feelings, attitudes, beliefs and values that are involved there. Again, if you need to pause the video for a few moments, go ahead. There are a lot of things that can cause conflict in a parent-teacher communication. Things like the parent's expectations of a student's achievement. They can be unrealistic if they're not fully aware of the situation. Unpleasant emotions can cause problems. For example, a worried, frustrated parent, their emotional state can cause the situation to escalate and turn to anger. And there's also the problem of external factors that are out with your control, where there are other people in the situation who are getting involved, putting in their tuppence worth. The other problem that we have in our British schools here in Spain is the language barrier, and under a conflict situation, the communication of complex issues outside of your first language can be really difficult. You may not have the nuances of vocabulary to be able to communicate effectively exactly what you're trying to say in a way that's not going to cause any offence. Also, the cultural differences involved in the two different languages are going to have an impact there. So some causes of conflict can be caused by personality styles, different perceptions and goals, pressures, personal values, and of course the changing policies within the school. Perhaps you might recognise some of these from your little thinking task on the iceberg that could have caused the conflict that you were thinking about. So to resolve conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. If it's resolved effectively, it can lead to growth and a positive relationship. An effective conflict resolution can make the difference between a positive and a negative outcome. Successfully resolving a conflict can increase understanding and cohesion, expanding both parties' awareness of the situation, giving you ideas as to how to achieve future goals together and build a stronger, positive relationship. Unfortunately, if it's not handled effectively, the results can be very damaging. Conflicting goals can turn into personal dislike, relationships can break down, and it's too easy to end up in a vicious downward spiral of negativity and recrimination. In the 1970s, Kenneth Thomas and Ralph Kilman identified 5 main styles of dealing with conflict, varying in their degrees of cooperativeness and assertiveness. They argued that people typically have a preferred conflict resolution style, but also that different styles are useful in different situations. Let's take each of these styles in turn. A competing conflict style, someone who takes a competitive style, would take a firm stand. They're very assertive, they know what they want, and they're not particularly cooperative. It can be useful using this style in a situation where there's an emergency and a quick decision is required, or an unpopular decision is needed, or trying to defend against someone exploiting a situation. People who tend towards a collaborative style are very assertive, they're putting their own ideas across, but they're also very cooperative, they're willing to meet everyone's needs and acknowledge that everyone's important. So this can be really useful when you're bringing together diverse viewpoints and when there have been previous conflicts. I would suggest this is a particularly useful style generally in dealing with conflicts with parents. People who tend towards a compromising style are in the middle between assertivity and passivity, and in the middle between cooperativeness and uncooperativeness. So they're trying to find a solution that's going to partially satisfy everyone, and they expect everyone to compromise. This can be quite useful, again, with parents where the cost of conflict is high, and in the case of deadlock or a looming deadline, it can be particularly useful to get a decision made. People who tend towards an avoiding style are tending towards being passive and uncooperative, so they're actually trying to avoid the conflict and delegating decisions to other people, or accepting the default decision. So this can be useful in a situation where victory is impossible or where someone else is in a better position to resolve the problem. And finally, people who tend towards an accommodating style know when to give in. They're very cooperative and fairly passive under these circumstances, so they can be persuaded to surrender a position. This style can be useful when the issues are more important to the other person or where you want to be in a position to collect on a favour, but I would suggest using this conflict style requires you to very much know where your boundaries are and to stand slightly more assertively for what you require. So this type of conflict resolution, the interest-based relational approach, respect individual differences while still helping people to avoid becoming too entrenched in a fixed position. So these are the steps that are followed: setting the scene, gathering information, agreeing the problem, brainstorming solutions, negotiating a solution, and following up. Let's take this step by step. So, to set the scene, the first thing you need to do is identify that the problem is a mutual one, and a mutual problem is best resolved through discussion and negotiation. This, again, like I said in the first video, puts both parties firmly on the same side against the problem rather than against one another. The next thing to do is to restate the problem. So make it clear that you're stating your perception of the problem and encourage the parent to restate their perception of the problem too. And then you're going to use your active listening skills to make sure you hear and understand the parent's position and perceptions and restate what they're telling you. Finally, you're going to summarise by putting both sides of the story together to summarise exactly what the problem is, the whole problem, from both perspectives. So now moving on to the second step of gathering information. We want here to identify the underlying interests, needs and concerns of the parent. So you're asking for their viewpoint and you're confirming that you respect their opinion and you need their cooperation to solve the problem. Try to understand the problem in objective terms, so focus on the issues and leave personalities out of the discussion. So some tools you can use to help you with this are listening with empathy, being clear and concise, using I statements to remind the parent that your opinion also matters, remaining flexible and clarifying feelings because they need to be recognised before you can move on to resolve the conflict. The third step is agreeing the problem. So you've made sure that everyone's got the same perception of the problem and you're agreeing on what exactly it is that you're trying to resolve. This sounds like an obvious step, but often different underlying needs, interests and goals can cause people to perceive problems very differently. If you're clear on what the problem is, it's a lot easier to find a mutually beneficial solution. The next step is to brainstorm possible solutions. So make sure everyone has a fair input, be open to all ideas and be willing to consider everything. If everyone's going to feel satisfied with the resolution, it will help if everyone has had a say in the possible solutions. For me, brainstorming is getting everything out, even if it's crazy, and then sifting through to find what is useful in amongst all that information. Step 5 is negotiating a solution, and by this stage the problem might have been resolved already. Both sides hopefully have a better understanding of one another's positions and a mutually satisfactory solution may be clear. However, you may also have uncovered real differences between your positions, and this is where the conflict management styles that we just looked at come in. particularly compromising, which hopefully will produce a win-win situation. The final step is following up. Set a date for a follow-up. It doesn't have to be a meeting, it could be an email or a phone call, just to follow up and make sure that all parties are satisfied with the solution that you've come up with. You might find it useful to take notes or record the discussion in your meeting, particularly in the case of a more serious issue. This will be helpful for follow-up, or in the case where the problem needs to be escalated to management. Taking notes in a meeting can also have the effect of dissipating hostility, because the parent is aware that a third party, so to speak, the person who's then reading the notes, is in the situation and is aware of what's being said and what's being done. That's it. Thank you very much for listening, and the next video will explain a bit more about diffusing hostility.